The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's emergency room cast harsh shadows across Sarah Chen's face as she stared at the monitor displaying impossible numbers. In 6 hours, her career would either be over or transformed beyond recognition. The patient in Bay 7 was dying, despite what the tests showed, and the brilliant surgeon everyone trusted was making a lethal mistake. But Sarah's real problem wasn't the patient she was fighting to save. It was the one who'd just arrived in Trauma Bay 1, unconscious and bleeding. The man she'd spent 6 years trying to forget. The man whose secrets would destroy everything she'd built.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Sarah Chen had perfected the art of invisibility over 8 years of night shift nursing. At 32, she moved through St. Mary's emergency room like a shadow, efficient, competent, forgettable. That was exactly how she needed to be. Single mothers working night shift for the extra $3 an hour couldn't afford to make waves, couldn't afford to be noticed for anything except their reliability. The Philadelphia winter pressed against the hospital windows, turning them into black mirrors that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting and the controlled chaos within. Sarah checked her watch, 1:47 a.m. Emma would be asleep now in their small apartment, watched over by Mrs. Kim from downstairs. 9 years old and already so independent, so used to her mother's absence during the dark hours. The guilt was a constant companion, but so was the necessity. Night shift differential meant Emma's asthma medication, her school supplies, the small luxuries that made their life feel less like survival and more like living. St. Mary's emergency room sprawled in a semicircle around the central nurses' station, a command center of computer monitors, medication carts, and perpetually ringing phones. 12 treatment bays radiated outward, separated by curtains that provided only the illusion of privacy. The air carried the distinctive hospital smell, antiseptic, anxiety, and the peculiar metallic tang of blood inadequately cleaned. Sarah's supervisor, Linda Torres, had been at St. Mary's for 25 years. At 55, Linda carried herself with the unhurried authority of someone who'd seen every possible emergency, and most impossible ones. She wore her gray-streaked hair in a practical bun and kept photographs of her 3 grandchildren tucked into her badge holder. Linda had trained Sarah during her first weeks at St. Mary's, teaching her not just the technical skills, but the psychological armor necessary to survive emergency medicine. More importantly, Linda had taught her when to speak up and when to stay silent, a lesson Sarah had taken perhaps too much to heart. Tonight started normally. Sarah arrived at 9:45 p.m., 15 minutes early as always. She reviewed the board. 8 beds occupied, ranging from a construction worker with a lacerated hand to a college student having a panic attack. Nothing unusual. She tied her dark hair back, clipped her badge to her navy scrubs, and began her rounds with the methodical efficiency that had become second nature. By midnight, the ER had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The daytime chaos of screaming children and impatient families gave way to a different clientele. The isolated, the desperate, those for whom darkness amplified pain. Sarah worked steadily, checking vitals, administering medications, documenting everything with the thoroughness that had kept her employed and unremarkable. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at 1 a.m. for his overnight shift, and the ER's atmosphere shifted subtly. At 48, Webb was tall and commanding with precisely styled silver hair and an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he gestured. He'd inherited his family's pharmaceutical fortune, but practiced medicine with fierce intensity, as if constantly proving he'd earned his position through merit rather than birthright. Webb was brilliant, capable of diagnosing obscure conditions that stumped other physicians. He was also imperious, dismissive of nurses' observations, and prone to cold fury when questioned. Sarah had learned to present information to him efficiently and without editorial comment. She'd watched other nurses try to offer clinical insights only to be cut down with withering remarks about staying in the lane. Webb believed in rigid hierarchy. Physicians diagnosed and decided. Nurses executed those decisions. It was clean, simple, and occasionally deadly. At 2:17 a.m., the ambulance bay doors crashed open. Paramedics wheeled in an elderly woman, conscious but clearly frightened.
Sarah took the handoff report. Martha Rodriguez, 73, found by her daughter complaining of chest discomfort and shortness of breath. History of hypertension, otherwise healthy. Vital signs stable, but patient insistent something was wrong. Sarah assigned Mrs. Rodriguez to base 7 and began her assessment with practice efficiency. The elderly woman's grip was surprisingly strong. As she clutched Sarah's hand, her dark eyes wide with fear that seemed disproportionate to her relatively normal vital signs. Sarah had learned to trust that fear. The body often knew something was catastrophically wrong before machines could measure it. Blood pressure slightly elevated, but not dangerous. 148/92. Heart rate faster than ideal, 98. Oxygen saturation at 94%, lower than normal, but not critical. Mrs. Rodriguez's skin was cool and slightly clammy. Her description of the chest discomfort was vague, not pain exactly, but pressure, like something squeezing. It had started during dinner and had been gradually intensifying. Sarah ordered the standard cardiac workup: EKG, chest X-ray, complete blood count, and cardiac enzymes, the blood tests that could reveal heart muscle damage. While waiting for results, she checked her other patients. The construction worker had been stitched and discharged. A new patient had arrived with a kidney stone. Sarah moved through her tasks efficiently, but her mind kept returning to base 7 and the fear in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. The initial results came back at 2:43 a.m. The EKG showed some non-specific changes, minor variations in the heart's electrical pattern that could mean something or nothing. The chest X-ray was clear. The first cardiac enzyme panel came back within normal limits. By every objective measure, Mrs. Rodriguez was stable. Dr. Webb reviewed the results with barely concealed impatience. He was suturing the facial laceration in Bay 3, and I could see his jaw tighten when I approached with Mrs. Rodriguez's chart. He presented the information concisely, knowing Webb hated elaboration. Patient with chest discomfort, initial workup unremarkable, vital stable, but patient remains anxious. Webb glanced at the chart without really seeing Mrs. Rodriguez as a person. He made his assessment quickly: anxiety attack, possibly panic disorder. Standard treatment: Ativan for anxiety, observation for 2 hours, then discharge with instructions to follow up with their primary physician. He signed off on the orders without visiting Bay 7. Sarah stood at the nurse's station holding the chart, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She'd seen hundreds of anxiety attacks during her years in emergency medicine. They presented with hyperventilation, trembling, sometimes a sense of impending doom that responded to reassurance. Mrs. Rodriguez's presentation was different. Her fear was specific, physical, insistent. She kept saying she had never felt this way before, that something inside her was breaking. But Sarah also knew the risk of questioning Webb. She thought of Emma asleep at home, of the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, of the precarious balance of her carefully constructed life. She thought of all the times she had seen other nurses challenge physicians and suffer for it. Assignments to the worst shifts, exclusion from training opportunities, the subtle professional death by 1,000 cuts. She administered the Ativan as ordered and told herself she was being paranoid. The tests were normal. Dr. Webb had decades of experience. Who was she to second-guess his clinical judgment based on nothing but a feeling? At 3:15 a.m., Sarah returned to Base 7 to check on Mrs. Rodriguez. The Ativans should have calmed her, but if anything, she seemed more distressed. Her hand shot out and gripped Sarah's wrist with desperate strength. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "Please, I'm dying. I can feel it." Sarah made a decision that felt both small and enormous. She ordered a second set of cardiac enzymes, marking them as urgent, and a repeat EKG. It violated standard protocol. Cardiac enzymes were typically drawn 6 hours apart, but something in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes demanded action. She called Dr. Webb. Sarah's hand trembled as she dialed, unaware that in the next 60 seconds, everything would change. Because while she was focused on the patient in Bay 7, the ambulance bay doors were about to crash open with the trauma case that would shatter her carefully constructed world and reveal a secret that would make saving Mrs. Rodriguez the least of her problems.
Dr. Webb's voice came through the phone sharp with irritation. He'd been catching a brief rest in the break room, and Sarah had interrupted him to report what he clearly considered insignificant findings. The troponin increase was minimal, well within normal variation. The EKG changes were nonspecific. He reminded her that anxiety could cause all sorts of physical symptoms and that not every worried patient was having a medical emergency. Sarah forced herself to speak calmly, professionally. She presented her clinical observations, the patient's continued distress despite Ativan, the trend in cardiac enzymes, the specific quality of the chest discomfort. She recommended continued observation and possibly a cardiology consult when the department opened at 7 a.m. The silence on Webb's ends lasted 3 seconds that felt eternal. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. He asked if Sarah was questioning his clinical judgment. He reminded her that his training at Johns Hopkins, his 15 years of emergency medicine experience, his board certifications. He told her that slight laboratory variations were normal, that this was a clear anxiety case, and that they didn't have the resources to admit every nervous patient who came through the door. Then he gave her a direct order: prepare Mrs. Rodriguez for discharge. He would complete the paperwork himself when he finished with his current patient. Sarah felt the familiar instinct to comply, to apologize, to make herself small and agreeable. But something had shifted inside her during this shift, some line she hadn't known existed until she found herself standing at it. Her voice remained steady as she spoke words that felt like jumping off a cliff. I'm not comfortable with that discharge plan. I'm going to document my concerns in the medical record. If you want to discharge this patient against nursing recommendation, that's your decision, but I need it noted in the chart. The explosion was immediate. Webb slammed through the break room door and strode to the nurse's station, his face flushed with anger. His voice rose above the ambient noise of the ER, loud enough that nearby patients turned their heads. He demanded to know who Sarah thought she was, what gave her the authority to override a physician's orders, whether she understood how insubordination worked in a hospital setting. Sarah stood her ground, her posture straight, her hands steady at her sides despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She repeated that she wasn't overriding anything, she was advocating for her patient. If he chose to discharge Mrs. Rodriguez, that was his medical decision, but she would document her disagreement and wouldn't sign the discharge paperwork. The ER had gone quiet, every staff member frozen in position, watching the confrontation unfold. This kind of direct challenge to a physician simply didn't happen, especially not from a night shift nurse, especially not to someone with Webb's reputation and connections. Linda Torres materialized at Sarah's elbow with perfect timing. Her presence was calm, authoritative, carrying the weight of 25 years of nursing experience. She addressed Webb with careful respect, suggesting that they discuss the case privately in the consultation room. Webb, suddenly aware of his audience, agreed with visible reluctance. Sarah didn't hear what transpired in that room, but she could imagine Linda's approach, diplomatic but firm, reminding Webb that Sarah was one of her best nurses, that when someone with Sarah's consistent judgment raised concerns, they were worth considering. Linda would have suggested a compromise: keep Mrs. Rodriguez for extended observation, run another set of cardiac enzymes at the 6-hour mark, consult cardiology when they came on duty at 7 a.m. When they emerged, Webb looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, but he agreed to the modified plan. He told Sarah curtly to continue monitoring the patient and walked away without another word. The ER slowly resumed its normal rhythm, though Sarah felt the sidewise glances from colleagues, some admiring, some worried about what she'd just done, all wondering about the consequences. Sarah returned to Bay 7, where Mrs. Rodriguez had been listening to the distant sounds of the confrontation. The elderly woman's eyes were wet with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for you." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't cause anything. This is my job, making sure you're safe." At 4:02 a.m., as Sarah was documenting her latest assessment of Mrs. Rodriguez, the ambulance bay doors exploded open with a metallic crash that signaled a critical trauma. 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher carrying an unconscious man in his mid-40s, his face covered in blood, his body frighteningly still. Sarah's head snapped up at the commotion. The handoff report came rapid-fire: unidentified male, found unconscious at the bottom of a stairwell, possible assault or fall, severe head trauma, GCS of 7 indicating serious altered consciousness, intubated in the field. The paramedics then found a wallet with identification, but no emergency contact information. Sarah started to return her attention to her charting when she heard the name: Robert Chen, 45 years old. The world tilted sideways. Sarah's chins gripped the edge of the nurse's station as the voices around her became distant and distorted. Robert Chen wasn't a common name, but it wasn't unique either. Philadelphia had a large Asian American population. It couldn't be her Robert. Her ex-husband had disappeared 6 years ago, leaving no forwarding address, no way to contact him. The universe couldn't be cruel enough to bring him back like this. But something made her walk toward Trauma Bay 1. Some terrible certainty pulled her forward against every instinct screaming at her to stay away. She reached the doorway and looked at the man on the stretcher, his face swollen and bloody but unmistakable. It was Robert, Emma's father. The man who'd walked out on them when Emma was 3 years old, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and unanswered questions. Sarah felt her professional training kick in automatically, even as her personal world shattered. She stepped back from the Trauma Bay entrance, her mind racing. Protocol was clear. She couldn't be involved in the care of a family member. She needed to disclose the relationship immediately to the attending physician and remove herself from any role in his treatment.
But even as she prepared to do exactly that, a voice in her head whispered dangerous questions.
If she'd disclosed now, there would be questions. Did she know his medical history? Did she know what happened to him? Was there any suspicion of domestic involvement? And most critically, where had Robert been for 6 years? And why was he in Philadelphia when he'd supposedly moved to California? Sarah realized with cold clarity that she knew none of these answers. Robert had vanished completely, cutting off all contact. She'd received no child support, no birthday cards for Emma, no acknowledgement of their existence. She'd moved on, built a life, told Emma age-appropriate stories about how sometimes daddies couldn't be there, but it wasn't because of anything Emma did wrong. Now he was here, broken and unconscious, and revealing their connection would pull Sarah into whatever situation had left him bleeding at the bottom of a stairwell. It would raise questions about her own past, might trigger investigations into her personal life, could create complications she couldn't afford. Dr. Webb took charge of the trauma case, suddenly energized. This was the kind of medicine he excelled at: high stakes, clear protocols, dramatic interventions. He barked orders with confident authority, orchestrating the team with impressive efficiency. CT scan ordered, labs drawn, neurosurgery called for immediate consultation. Sarah watched from outside the trauma bay, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew she should speak up. Every second of silence was a violation of protocol, a professional breach that would look worse the longer she waited. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with 6 years of anger and abandonment, and the desperate desire to protect Emma from whatever darkness had followed Robert back into their lives. Linda Torres found Sarah standing frozen in the hallway at 4:15 a.m. Linda's observant eyes took in Sarah's pale face and rigid posture. She pulled Sarah into the medication room, away from curious eyes and ears. "Do you know that patient?" Linda asked quietly. Sarah's mouth opened, closed. The truth fought with self-preservation. Finally, she whispered, "That's Robert Chen, my ex-husband, Emma's father." Linda's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something shift in her eyes. Concern, calculation, professional assessment of the situation's complications. "How long since you've seen him?" 6 years, since he left us. I have no idea what he's been doing, where he's been living, nothing. We've had 0 contact. Linda nodded slowly. "Sarah, you need to disclose this to Dr. Webb immediately. The longer you wait, the worse it looks. I understand the impulse to protect yourself and Emma from whatever situation he's in, but this is not the way." "I know." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "I know you're right. What if he's in trouble? What if the police get involved and start asking about our marriage, about why he left? What if Emma has to find out her father is what?" Linda's question was gentle but firm. Sarah realized she didn't know how to finish that sentence. A criminal? A victim? Someone who destroyed another family the way he destroyed theirs? The truth was, she knew almost nothing about the man Robert had become after he'd walked away from them. As Sarah prepared to disclose her relationship to Robert, the trauma bay erupted in controlled chaos. His blood pressure was crashing, and Dr. Webb was making split-second decisions about treatment. But what Sarah overheard in those disparate minutes would reveal something far worse than she'd imagined. A pattern that would connect Robert's present to her past in ways that would make her question everything she thought she knew about her marriage.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Sarah stepped out of the medication room with Linda behind her, prepared to make the disclosure that protocol demanded. But before she could reach Trauma Bay 1, an alarm shrieked from inside. Robert's blood pressure had dropped catastrophically. The monitor showed numbers that meant he was dying. Dr. Webb's voice cut through the chaos, calling out orders with machine gun precision. Blood transfusion, fluids wide open, preparing for emergency intubation adjustment. The neurosurgeon hadn't arrived yet, and the CT scan results showed Robert had a massive brain bleed that required immediate surgery. But he was too unstable to move to the operating room. Webb had to stabilize him here, now, or Robert would die in the trauma bay. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, caught between professional obligation and a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't fully untangle. Part of her, the part that had loved him once, that had believed in their future, that had created Emma with him, felt desperate fear at the thought of him dying. But another part, the part that had struggled alone for 6 years, that had held Emma through her tears about why Daddy didn't visit, felt a dark whisper that his death might be easier than his survival. The confession died in her throat. She couldn't interrupt this moment, couldn't pull Dr. Webb away from a life-saving intervention to disclose a personal connection that had no bearing on the immediate medical decisions. She would tell him after they'd stabilized Robert, after the crisis passed. It would be a delay, not a deception. Linda gave her a look that communicated both understanding and warning. Sarah nodded fractionally. She would disclose soon as possible. Linda squeezed her shoulder and moved to help with the trauma, her experienced hands anticipating Webb's needs. Sarah forced herself to return to Mrs. Rodriguez in Bay 7. Her shift would end in 2 hours, and she had other patients who needed her attention. She couldn't stand in the hallway obsessing over Robert's condition, but her hands shook slightly as she checked Mrs. Rodriguez's vital signs, and the elderly woman noticed. "Are you okay, Mia?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked softly, her own fear temporarily forgotten in concern for her nurse. Sarah plastered on a professional smile. "I'm fine. Just a complicated case in the trauma bay. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "The pressure in my chest is still there. The medicine made me feel calmer, but it didn't make it go away. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense, and it confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Anxiety medication might calm Mrs. Rodriguez's emotional response to her symptoms, but it wouldn't touch the underlying physical cause. If she was having a heart attack, the ottoman was just masking the urgency while the damage continued. At 4:47 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, probably a wrong number, but something made her check. The message was brief. "Is this Sarah Chen? This is Officer Patricia Morrison, Philadelphia PD. We need to speak with you regarding Robert Chen. Please call immediately." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She stepped into the break room and dialed the number with shaking fingers. Officer Morrison answered on the first ring. "Ms. Chen? Thank you for calling back so quickly. I understand Robert Chen is your ex-husband." "Yes," she managed. "We've been divorced for 6 years. No contact since then. I just found out he was brought to St. Mary's tonight. I need to ask you some questions about your marriage to Robert Chen. Can you come down to the station, or would you prefer we meet at the hospital?" What is this about? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Officer Morrison hesitated, then said, "Mr. Chen was involved in a domestic violence incident tonight. His current partner reported that he became violent during an argument, and she pushed him in self-defense when he cornered her at the top of a stairwell. He fell, resulting in his injuries. We're investigating whether there's a pattern of violence in his history." The break room seemed to tilt around Sarah. Domestic violence. A pattern of violence. She thought back to our marriage, to the years she'd carefully tucked into a mental box labeled "The Past. Do not open." Robert had never hit her. She was certain of that. But had he been violent in other ways? She remembered the holes punched in walls during his rages, the dishes smashed in the kitchen when dinner wasn't to his liking, the way he'd grip her arm during arguments, hard enough to leave bruises she'd explained away as clumsiness, the time he kicked a toy across the room because Emma's crying woke him up, the toy smashing against the wall inches from where their daughter sat. She told herself it was stress, financial pressure, the difficulty of new parenthood. She made excuses because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting her marriage was built on something dangerous, that the man she had loved was capable of cruelty. "Miss Chen?" Officer Morrison's voice pulled her back to the present. "He never hit me," Sarah said quietly. "But there were other things. Things I didn't really recognize as abuse at the time. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? We have 2 other women who filed restraining orders against Mr. Chen in the past 3 years. Your testimony about his behavior during your marriage could establish a pattern. 2 other women. 2 other women who had experienced whatever Sarah had experienced. 2 other women who had been brave enough to name it as abuse and seek protection. Yes, Sarah heard herself say. Yes, I'll make a statement. But I need to know, his current partner, is she okay? She's shaken but uninjured. She's been very cooperative with our investigation. Mr. Chen has a history of these incidents, Miss Chen. You're not alone in this. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the break room trying to process this information. Robert hadn't just abandoned them. He'd moved on to her other people. The violence that had simmered beneath the surface of their marriage had apparently escalated after he left. And now those other women's courage in reporting him might finally bring consequences. But there was Emma to consider, her daughter, who still asked about her father sometimes, who had created an idealized version of him in her imagination to fill the void of his absence. How could Sarah tell her that Daddy wasn't just absent, he was dangerous? At 5:15 a.m., Sarah finally made the disclosure to Dr. Webb. Robert had been stabilized enough for transport to the CT scanner, and Webb had emerged from the trauma bay looking exhausted. Sarah pulled him aside and stated it plainly. Robert Chen was her ex-husband. They'd been divorced for 6 years with no contact since then. She should have disclosed immediately and apologized for the delay. Webb's reaction surprised her. His earlier anger seemed to have burned away, leaving only grim focus. He acknowledged the disclosure with a brief nod and told Sarah to remove herself from any care related to Robert Chen. Then he added something unexpected. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. Ex-spouses showing up in the ER is always complicated. His momentary humanity caught Sarah off guard. She mumbled thanks and retreated, realizing that Webb was capable of empathy when circumstances penetrated his usual arrogance. The next hour passed in a blur. The neurosurgeon arrived and reviewed Robert's scans. The prognosis was grim. Even if he survived surgery, significant brain damage was likely. Sarah focused on her other patients, mechanically going through the motions while her mind spun with implications. At 6:07 a.m., the alarm from Base 7 shattered her distraction. Mrs. Rodriguez. Sarah ran, her exhaustion forgotten in the spike of adrenaline. She reached the bay to find Mrs. Rodriguez in obvious distress, her hand clutching her chest, her face contorted with pain that could no longer be masked or dismissed. The monitor screamed, heart rate spiking to 142, blood pressure plummeting to 88/54, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. Sarah's training took over completely. She called for help, initiated the cardiac emergency protocol, administered oxygen and aspirin, established a second IV line. Dr. Webb appeared within seconds, his face registering immediate understanding. This was the heart attack Sarah had been warning about, the disaster that had been building all night while the tests remained deceptively normal. To his credit, Webb didn't waste time with recriminations or justifications. He took over Mrs. Rodriguez's care with focused intensity, ordering medications to support her blood pressure and heart function, calling for immediate cardiac catheterization, paging the on-call cardiologist who was just arriving for morning rounds. The next 20 minutes were a choreographed dance of emergency intervention. Mrs. Rodriguez was stabilized just enough for transport to the cardiac catheterization lab, where they would thread a catheter through her blood vessels to find and open the blocked artery strangling her heart. Sarah rode with her in the elevator, holding her hand, murmuring reassurances she desperately hoped were true. As Sarah watched Mrs. Rodriguez disappear into the cath lab, she thought the worst was over, that she'd saved one life and could now face the complications of Robert's reappearance with her career intact. She had no idea that in the next 30 minutes, she would discover the real reason Robert came to Philadelphia, a truth that would connect him to St. Mary's Hospital in a way that would turn her entire understanding of the past 6 years inside out.
Sarah returned to the ER at 6:35 a.m., her shift officially over but unable to leave until she knew Mrs. Rodriguez's outcome. The day shift nurses were arriving, fresh-faced and energetic, chatting about their mornings, while Sarah felt like she'd lived through a month in the past 9 hours. Linda Torres found her in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee she didn't remember pouring. Linda sat down across from her, and in the quiet of that moment, Sarah felt the full weight of the night crash over her. She'd been right about Mrs. Rodriguez. If they discharged her as Webb initially ordered, she would have died at home. But that small victory felt hollow against the larger chaos Robert's reappearance had unleashed. "Administration wants to see you at 7, Linda said gently. "They know about the situation with Robert Chen and about your disagreement with Dr. Webb regarding Mrs. Rodriguez. We need to address both issues formally." Sarah nodded numbly. She'd expected this. Hospital administration couldn't ignore either incident, the challenge to a physician's authority or the delayed disclosure about a family relationship. Her career might survive one controversy, but 2 in one night might be too many. At 6:52 a.m., Sarah's phone rang. Officer Morrison again. "Miss Chen, I need to inform you of some developments in our investigation. Can you talk?" Sarah stepped into the hallway, seeking privacy. "Yes, what is it?" "We've been digging into Robert Chen's activities over the past few years. His current partner gave us access to his computer and documents. Miss Chen, did you know he'd been living in Philadelphia for the past 8 months?" The hallway seemed to spin. "That's impossible. I would have known. He would have tried to contact Emma or—" "He was living in Center City under his legal name, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep. And Miss Chen, there's more. He had extensive files on his computer about you and your daughter. Photos, obviously taken from a distance, your work schedule, Emma's school information. He'd been watching you." Sarah's knees buckled. She pressed her back against the wall for support. "What? Why would he—" "We're not entirely sure yet. His partner says he became obsessed with unfinished business about 6 months ago. He told her he had a daughter he'd abandoned and that he needed to make things right. But the documentation we found suggests something more concerning. He had detailed notes about your routines, your vulnerabilities. There are references to Emma that suggest he was planning to take her." The words landed like physical blows. Custody battle? Kidnapping? Sarah's mind reeled through the implications. Robert had no legal rights to Emma. He voluntarily terminated his parental rights as part of the divorce settlement, unable to contest Sarah's request because he had already disappeared. But that didn't mean he couldn't try to take Emma anyway. "There's one more thing," Officer Morrison continued. "Did you know Robert was working for Dalton Pharmaceuticals?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Dalton Pharmaceuticals was the company that owned and operated St. Mary's Hospital. It was why she'd always gotten good benefits, despite being part-time night shift. Dalton took care of its hospital employees because it was ultimately taking care of its own interests. He was trying to get information about hospital systems. We're still analyzing his files, but it appears he was specifically researching St. Mary's security protocols, shift schedules, and employee databases. We believe he was planning to use his position at Dalton to access information that would help him get to Emma through you." Sarah's mind flashed to all the times over the past months she'd felt like someone was watching her. The times she dismissed as paranoia, as the natural anxiety of a single mother working night shift at a big city. Those instincts had been right. Robert had been stalking her, studying her, preparing for something. "Miss Chen, given this information, we need to discuss protective measures for you and your daughter. I'm also going to need to coordinate with hospital security about potential breaches." Sarah stopped listening, her mind fixating on one terrifying thought. Emma was at home right now with Mrs. Chen. Emma, who knew her father's name, who would possibly open the door if someone claiming to be her daddy showed up. Emma, who Sarah had always told that her father loved her but just couldn't be there, creating the perfect vulnerability for manipulation. She interrupted Officer Morrison. "I need to call home right now." Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, Mrs. Kim answered, sounding slightly sleepy but calm. Emma was fine, still sleeping. No one had come to the door. Everything was normal. Sarah gave Mrs. Kim specific instructions. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't let Emma out of her sight, and call 911 immediately if anything felt wrong. Mrs. Kim, sensing the urgency, agreed without questions.
At 7 a.m., Sarah sat in the hospital administrator's office, surrounded by people who would determine her professional future. Present were David Chen, no relation, the coincidence of the name felt like cosmic mockery, the hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Okafor, chief of emergency medicine, Linda Torres, and Margaret Sullivan from HR. They knew everything. Webb's formal complaint about Sarah's insubordination, the delayed disclosure about Robert Chen, and now, thanks to Officer Morrison's call to hospital security, they knew about Robert's surveillance and his potential plans involving the hospital. David Chen spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. Miss Chen, this has been an extraordinarily complicated night. We need to address multiple issues, but I want to start with the most important question. Are you and your daughter safe? I appreciate that this was his first concern. Officer Morrison is arranging protective measures. My ex-husband is currently in critical condition and unable to pose an immediate threat. But yes, I'm concerned about what happens when he recovers. Dr. Okafor leaned forward. Let's talk about the clinical situation with Mrs. Rodriguez first. I've reviewed the case notes, the test results, and the outcome. Sarah, you were right to push back on the discharge plan. Mrs. Rodriguez had what we call an NSTEMI, a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. Her cardiac enzymes were rising, but slowly enough that the initial tests appeared normal. If she'd been discharged, she would have died at home within hours. Sarah felt validation wash over her, but Dr. Okafor wasn't finished. However, the way you challenged Dr. Webb created a significant disruption in the ER. I understand you felt you had no choice, but there are protocols for escalating concerns that don't involve direct confrontation in front of patients and staff. With respect, Dr. Okafor, Linda Torres interjected, what protocols would you have recommended? Sarah came to me first. I intervened with Dr. Webb. The situation was de-escalated as quickly as possible given the urgency. If Sarah had gone through more formal channels, filing an incident report, requesting a committee review, Mrs. Rodriguez would have been discharged and died while we waited for bureaucracy. Margaret Sullivan from HR consulted her notes. Dr. Webb submitted a formal complaint alleging insubordination and unprofessional conduct. However, he contacted us an hour ago to withdraw that complaint. He stated that upon reflection, Ms. Chen's clinical judgment was sound and that the outcome justified her advocacy. Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face. Webb had withdrawn his complaint, the man whose ego she had bruised in front of the entire night shift. Dr. Okafor nodded. Marcus Webb is many things, but he's not blind to good medicine when he sees it. Mrs. Rodriguez is alive because of your persistence. He recognizes that, even if his pride was hurt in the process. However, we still need to address how these situations are handled going forward. David Chen took over. As for the delayed disclosure about Robert Chen, that's more complicated. Sarah, you violated protocol by not immediately identifying your relation to the patient. In any other circumstance, that would result in serious disciplinary action. Sarah opened her mouth to accept whatever consequences were coming, but Chen held up his hand. However, given what we now know about Robert Chen's activities, his surveillance, his position at Dalton, and his apparent plans regarding your daughter, we understand why you hesitated. You are in shock and trying to protect yourself and Emma from a dangerous situation. That doesn't excuse the protocol violation, but it provides context. He paused, exchanging glances with Dr. Okafor and Margaret Sullivan. Here's what we're proposing. You'll receive a formal written warning for the delayed disclosure. It will remain in your file for 1 year, after which it will be removed if there are no further incidents. You'll complete additional ethics training focused on managing conflicts of interest in emergency situations. Sarah nodded. Relief flooded through her. A written warning she could live with. As for the clinical situation with Mrs. Rodriguez, we're implementing new protocols based on what happened tonight. We're creating a formal chain of advocacy that allows nurses to escalate patient safety concerns through nursing management without direct confrontation with attending physicians. We're also mandating regular training on collaborative decision-making and respectful communication for all physicians. Linda Torres smiled slightly. In other words, Sarah, you've just changed hospital policy. Your willingness to stand up for your patient is going to make it easier for every nurse who comes after you.
There's one more thing. David Chen said. "Given the situation with your ex-husband and his connection to Dalton Pharmaceuticals, we're offering you the option to transfer. We have an opening in the cardiac step-down unit on night shift. Different floor, different patient population, but still challenging work. Or, if you prefer, we can arrange a day shift position in the ER, though I know that would complicate your childcare situation." Sarah considered the options. The cardiac unit would be less chaotic than the ER, with longer-term patient relationships instead of the constant turnover of emergency medicine. It would also provide some distance from the trauma of this night, from Robert's continued presence in the hospital until he could be transferred elsewhere. "I'll take the cardiac unit position," Sarah said quietly. "I think Emma and I both need a fresh start." At 7:45 a.m., Sarah finally left the administrative office. She had one more thing to do before going home. She stopped by the cardiac catheterization lab recovery area, where Mrs. Rodriguez was resting after her procedure. The cardiologist had successfully opened her blocked artery. She would make a full recovery. Mrs. Rodriguez was awake, her daughter sitting beside her, holding her hand. When she saw Sarah, her eyes filled with tears. "They told me," she said softly. "They told me I would have died if you hadn't insisted. You saved my life." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "You saved your own life by trusting your instincts. You knew something was wrong and you refused to be dismissed. That's what made the difference." Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter stood and embraced Sarah. "Thank you. Thank you for listening to her. Thank you for not giving up." Sarah left the hospital at 8:15 a.m., walking into bright October sunlight that felt surreal after the night's fluorescent urgency. She thought she understood the full scope of what had happened, that she'd saved a life, survived a professional crisis, and learned terrible truths about her past. But as she drove toward home in Emma, her phone would ring one more time, with information that would reveal the most devastating truth of all: the real reason Robert had come back, and what he'd already set in motion that she couldn't stop.
Sarah's phone rang as she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, too exhausted to start the engine. Officer Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah's stomach clenched. What else could possibly have happened? "Miss Chen, we finished analyzing Robert Chen's files. There's something you need to know immediately." Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for impact. "What is it?" "Robert filed for emergency custody of Emma 3 weeks ago in family court. He claimed you were an unfit mother, working night shifts, leaving Emma with inadequate supervision, unstable living conditions. He provided fabricated evidence, including photos that made your apartment look worse than it is, and statements from a fake social worker claiming to have concerns about Emma's welfare." The world stopped. "What? How is that possible? He terminated his parental rights. He can't just..." "Technically, he can petition to have those rights reinstated if he can prove changed circumstances and that it's in the child's best interest. His petition was scheduled for a hearing next week. He was building a case to present himself as a reformed, financially stable father who wanted to be part of his daughter's life." Sarah's mind reeled. "The surveillance? The information about my schedule? He was gathering evidence to use against me." "Exactly. And Miss Chen, there's worse news. 2 days ago, Robert was granted supervised visitation pending the custody hearing. The judge approved one supervised visit at a neutral location to assess Emma's wishes and Robert's parenting capabilities." "What? How did I not know about this? I never received any court documents." Officer Morrison's silence was heavy with significance. "The documents were sent to your address. We found them in Robert Chen's apartment, unopened, still in their envelopes, with your address visible. We believe he intercepted your mail. He worked for Dalton Pharmaceuticals, which meant he had access to employee information, including home addresses. He likely staked out your apartment building and took mail from your box before you could see it." Sarah felt like she was falling through space. Robert had orchestrated an entire legal case against her, and she'd been completely unaware. If he hadn't been injured in that fall, if his girlfriend hadn't fought back and involved the police, he might have succeeded. He might have shown up at Emma's school with a court order, might have taken her daughter away while Sarah was sleeping after a night shift. "What happens now?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The custody petition will be denied. Robert's injuries, combined with the evidence of his domestic violence history and his stalking behavior, make it clear he poses a danger. The judge will be notified of the circumstances. But Miss Chen, you need to get a lawyer. You need to file for a permanent restraining order, not just for yourself, but for Emma. And you need to document everything. His abandonment, his violence, his stalking. This might not be over even after the criminal charges are resolved. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her car as the morning sun climbed higher, watching hospital employees arrive for day shifts, continuing the eternal cycle of care. She thought about how close she'd come to losing everything, not just her career, but her daughter, her carefully constructed life, her sense of safety. But she'd also gained something tonight, the knowledge that her instincts were worth trusting, that speaking up mattered even when it was terrifying, that standing firm in the face of power could change outcomes. Sarah finally started her car and drove home through morning traffic, planning what she would say to Emma. Her daughter deserved age-appropriate truth. Daddy had been in an accident, but he was also someone who'd made bad choices and wasn't safe to be around. It would be a difficult conversation, but Sarah would handle it the way she'd handled everything else, with honesty, love, and determination to protect what mattered most. When she arrived at her apartment building, Mrs. Kim met her at the door with Emma already awake and dressed for the day. Emma launched herself at Sarah, wrapping small arms around her waist in a fierce hug. "Mommy, Mrs. Kim said you had a long night. Are you okay?" Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the undefinable sweetness of childhood. "I'm okay, baby. I'm better than okay. But we need to talk about some grown-up things." They sat on the worn couch in their small living room, Emma's hand clasped in Sarah's, while Sarah explained in simple terms that her daddy had been hurt, but also that he'd been making bad choices. That sometimes people who seemed like they loved you could actually be dangerous. That Emma didn't do anything wrong, but they would need to be extra careful for a while. Emma listened to the serious expression of a child forced to grow up too fast, then asked the question that broke Sarah's heart. "Did Daddy want to hurt me?" "I don't know what he wanted exactly, but I know that we're safe now, and I'm going to make sure we stay safe. You don't have to worry about that. That's my job." Emma thought about this, then said something that reminded Sarah why she fought so hard. "You're good at your job, Mommy. You take care of people. That's what Mrs. Kim says. She says you're the best nurse at the whole hospital." Sarah pulled Emma close, tears finally spilling over. "I try, baby. I really try."
3 months later, Sarah stood in the cardiac step-down unit at St. Mary's Hospital, reviewing labs for her patients. The night shift was quieter here than in the ER, fewer emergencies, more opportunities to build relationships with patients over the course of their multi-day stays. She missed the adrenaline of emergency medicine sometimes, but she appreciated the steadier rhythm, the chance to see patients improve rather than just stabilizing them and sending them elsewhere. Mrs. Rodriguez had become a regular presence in Sarah's life. After her recovery, she'd started volunteering with a heart health advocacy group, speaking to other elderly women about recognizing cardiac symptoms and refusing to be dismissed by medical professionals. She'd told her story dozens of times, always crediting the nurse who wouldn't give up with saving her life. Sarah had attended one of her presentations and been moved to tears by Mrs. Rodriguez's passion for helping others avoid her near miss with death. The custody battle had ended before it really began. Robert remained in a long-term care facility, his brain damage extensive enough that he would never regain the capacity to pursue legal action or pose a physical threat. The district attorney had dropped criminal charges given his condition, but the women he'd abused, including Sarah, had each received validation that their experiences were real, were believed, were part of a documented pattern of harm. Sarah had started therapy, working through the complicated grief of acknowledging her marriage had been abusive. The therapist helped her understand that abuse existed on a spectrum, that Robert's violence had been real even when it hadn't left visible bruises, that her survival strategy of minimizing and excusing his behavior had been necessary at the time but didn't need to define her understanding now. Emma was thriving. She'd processed her father's reappearance and disappearance with remarkable resilience, aided by child therapy sessions that gave her space to express complicated feelings about a parent she'd never really known. She'd recently announced that she wanted to be a nurse like her mother when she grew up,
which simultaneously filled Sarah with pride and worry about whether she'd set a good enough example. Dr. Marcus Webb had become an unexpected ally. The night with Mrs. Rodriguez had apparently triggered something in him, a recognition that his arrogance sometimes blinded him to important information. He'd started listening more carefully to nurses' concerns, occasionally asking Sarah's opinion on complicated cardiac cases, even though she'd transferred out of the ER. Their relationship would never be warm, but it had evolved into mutual professional respect. The hospital had implemented the new patient advocacy protocols, creating formal channels for nurses to raise concerns about discharge decisions or treatment plans. Sarah had been asked to help develop the training program, sharing Mrs. Rodriguez's case as an example of why systematic support for nursing judgment mattered. She'd stood in front of auditoriums full of medical professionals telling the story of that night, emphasizing that hierarchies were necessary for efficiency but couldn't be allowed to silence crucial observations. Linda Torres remained Sarah's strongest supporter and closest friend at work. She was retiring next month after 26 years at St. Mary's, and she told Sarah privately that seeing her stand up to Webb that night had been one of her proudest moments as a nursing supervisor. "I've spent my career teaching nurses to stay in their lane, but you reminded me that sometimes the lane is wrong and we need people brave enough to step out of it." On this particular night, 3 months after everything changed, Sarah was reviewing a new admission when her phone buzzed with a text from Emma's current babysitter. "All good here. Emma finished homework and we're watching a movie. She says tell you she loves you." Sarah smiled and sent back a heart emoji, then returned her attention to the patient chart. The patient was a 45-year-old woman admitted with chest pain, initial cardiac enzymes normal, EKG showing nonspecific changes. The attending physician had ordered standard observation, but was leaning toward discharge in the morning if repeat tests remained stable. Sarah read through the nurse's notes from the evening shift. The patient had described her chest pain as pressure, like something squeezing. She'd been feeling increasingly anxious despite normal test results. She kept insisting something was wrong, that she'd never felt this way before. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She reviewed the chart more carefully, noting the patient's risk factors, family history of heart disease, high blood pressure, previous smoker. The objective data said anxiety. The subjective presentation whispered something else. Sarah walked to the patient's room and introduced herself as the night nurse. She asked open-ended questions, listened carefully to the responses, observed the subtle signs of distress that monitors couldn't capture. The patient gripped Sarah's hand and said quietly, "Everyone keeps telling me I'm fine, but I'm scared. I feel like something terrible is about to happen." Sarah made a decision that felt both familiar and new. She called the attending physician and presented her concerns, the objective data versus the subjective presentation, the similarities to previous cases where women's cardiac symptoms had been dismissed as anxiety, her recommendation for continued close monitoring and consideration of additional testing. The physician, a young doctor Sarah hadn't worked with before, listened without interruption. Then she said something that made Sarah's eyes burn with unexpected tears. "Thank you for that assessment. You're right to be concerned. Let's order another set of cardiac enzymes in 2 hours and keep her on telemetry overnight. If anything changes, call me immediately. I trust your judgment." I trust your judgment. 5 words that represented everything Sarah had fought for that night 3 months ago. Recognition that her observations mattered, that her years of experience and trained instincts were valuable, that patient safety required collaboration rather than rigid hierarchy. The patient's repeat cardiac enzymes came back 2 hours later showing elevation. By 4 a.m., she was in the cardiac catheterization lab having an emergency procedure to open a blocked coronary artery. By 6 a.m., Sarah was documenting the outcome with profound gratitude that her voice had been heard, that this patient's life had been saved because the system had finally made space for nursing judgment to matter. As Sarah drove home in the early morning light, she thought about the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. A confrontation that could have ended her career had instead changed it for the better. A personal crisis that could have destroyed her family had instead revealed strengths she didn't know she possessed. A night that had tested every assumption about power, hierarchy, and whose voice deserved to be heard had ultimately proven that courage came in quiet forms, in standing firm when pressured to back down, in trusting instinct when data said otherwise, in refusing to accept that anyone's life was worth less than the comfort of authority. She thought about Emma, growing up with a mother who'd learned to speak up, to stand firm, to trust yourself, even when it was terrifying. That was, perhaps, the greatest gift she could give her daughter. Not protection from every danger, but the model of how to face danger with integrity intact. She pulled into her apartment building parking lot as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. Another night shift completed, another set of patients cared for, another day of building a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she'd chosen to do in response. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, where Emma would be waking up soon, where another day of ordinary miracles awaited. Sarah Chen, night shift nurse, single mother, survivor, advocate. She'd learned the hard way that the quietest voices sometimes needed to shout, that the system only changed when someone refused to stay silent, and saving lives sometimes meant risking everything you'd carefully constructed. But she'd also learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing what mattered most even when your hands shook and your career hung in the balance. It was standing in that emergency room at 3 a.m., telling a powerful man he was wrong, trusting that somewhere on the other side of that terrifying moment was a patient whose life would be saved because someone had refused to look away. That, Sarah had learned, was the real meaning of being a nurse. Not just following orders or executing protocols, but bearing witness to suffering and refusing to accept preventable death as inevitable. It was exhausting, terrifying, often thankless work, but it was also undeniably worth it. The conference room at the annual Patient Safety Summit held 200 healthcare professionals, but Sarah Chen felt like she was speaking to each of them individually. She stood at the podium in her navy blazer over scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in the same neat ponytail she'd worn that night 1 year ago. Emma sat in the front row beside Linda Torres, both beaming with pride. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm the clinical nurse manager of the cardiac care unit at St. Mary's Hospital in Philadelphia. A year ago, I was a night shift nurse who made a decision that changed my life. I challenged a physician's discharge order because I believed my patient was dying, even though all the tests said otherwise. She clicked to the first slide showing Mrs. Rodriguez's case data. That confrontation could have ended my career. In many hospitals, it would have. But instead, it saved a life and revealed something broken in our systems, that speaking up for patients shouldn't feel like professional suicide. Sarah walked through the case methodically, explaining the subtle signs that had worried her, the decision tree she had faced, and the aftermath. The audience was silent, many nodding in recognition of their own similar moments. Dr. Marcus Webb stood from the back row. Sarah had invited him, and several heads turned as he walked forward. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb. I was the attending physician who ordered that discharge. I was the one Nurse Chen challenged, and I want to tell you that she's being far too diplomatic about what happened. He faced the audience. I was arrogant. I dismissed her concerns because I believed my medical degree made me infallible. I filed a formal complaint against her, more concerned with my pride than patient welfare. I was wrong, and my ego nearly killed someone. The room remained absolutely silent as Webb pulled a challenge coin from his pocket. St. Mary's created these for staff who demonstrate exceptional patient advocacy. Sarah gave me this one after I completed collaborative care training. She said it was to remind me that admitting you're wrong takes more courage than pretending you're right. Sarah had to pause to compose herself before continuing. The night I challenged Dr. Webb, something else happened. My ex-husband was brought to the ER as a trauma patient. I didn't disclose our relationship immediately. That violation could have cost me my career. I learned that being an advocate for others doesn't mean you always make perfect decisions yourself. She explained the situation carefully, being honest about her failure and its consequences. The difference was that I worked in a system with enough integrity to hold me accountable, while also considering context. Sarah showed slides detailing the new protocols St. Mary's had implemented: the patient advocacy chain, mandatory collaborative care training, protection policies for nurses who raised safety concerns. Then she showed data that made the room go silent. Nursing turnover rates had dropped 23% since October. Patient satisfaction scores increased. Cardiac care outcomes improved across the board. When we created space for nurses to speak up without fear of retaliation, people stopped leaving. We're treating heart attacks earlier. We're preventing complications. We're saving lives. She looked directly at Emma in the front row. I'm a single mother. Every decision I make has to consider not just my career, but my daughter's welfare. Speaking up that night meant risking the job that pays our rent, buys her medication, but staying silent would have meant teaching her that protecting yourself is more important than protecting others. I couldn't do that. The applause built until the entire room was standing. Sarah stood overwhelmed as 200 healthcare professionals acknowledged not just her story, but their own struggles with these same issues. After the presentation, Sarah was surrounded by nurses sharing their own stories. Linda fielded questions about protocols, while Dr. Webb spoke with physicians about cultural change. During a brief lull, Webb approached Sarah. "You did well," he said simply. "Thank you for including me." "Your part matters," Sarah replied. "Not just because you admitted you were wrong, but because you changed. That gives people hope." Emma appeared, tugging Sarah's blazer. "Mom, Mrs. Rodriguez is here." In the lobby, Mrs. Rodriguez embraced Sarah warmly. The elderly woman looked vibrant in a red dress, healthy and strong, a passionate advocate for women's heart health, now speaking at events across the region. "Mija, I tell your story everywhere I go, the nurse who wouldn't give up on me." "You saved yourself by trusting your body," Sarah reminded her. "We saved each other," Mrs. Rodriguez corrected. "You trusted me enough to listen, and I trusted you enough to keep speaking. That's how it should work." Later, as Sarah and Emma walked through the October afternoon toward their car, Emma asked, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to be like you." "What do you mean, sweetie?" "I want to help people, but also I want to be brave enough to do what's right, even when it's scary, like you did." She pulled Emma close, breathing in her strawberry shampoo and the persistence of childhood innocence. "You're already braver than you know, and whatever you choose to do with your life, I'll be proud of you." As they drove home, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "You were amazing today. Dinner this week to celebrate." Sarah smiled and typed back a quick yes. She looked at Emma chattering about homework and dinner plans, at the city skyline with St. Mary's Hospital visible in the distance, at the life she'd built from that one night. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing what mattered most despite the fear. That speaking up sometimes meant standing alone initially, but others would eventually join you. That systems change slowly through persistent voices, and her one decision had created a crack that others were now pushing through. Most importantly, she learned her voice mattered not because she was special, but precisely because she wasn't. She was an ordinary nurse who'd spoken up, proving that if she could do it, maybe others could too.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.